She thought the guard was just for show, but the reality was shocking. On a blistering summer day in London, Debbie Whitmore, a wealthy tourist in her mid-40s, strutted confidently down the path to Buckingham Palace. Clad in luxury athleisure and designer sunglasses, she was the picture of someone used to VIP treatment. She'd been at the Ritz for breakfast, shopped at Harrods, and now she was determined to snap her perfect photo at the palace, as if the royal guards were just part of the scenery, no different from any other tourist attraction. The oppressive heat didn't seem to bother her. After all, her life had always been about convenience, comfort, and getting what she wanted. As she approached the palace, she noticed a crowd of tourists gathered to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Eager to get a perfect shot, Debbie ignored the orderly line of visitors waiting their turn. Shouldering past an elderly couple, she brushed them aside with a sharp, "Excuse me," her voice dripping with entitlement. She even swung her designer handbag carelessly, nearly hitting a child who ducked behind his mother. A palace attendant politely gestured to the line, but Debbie wasn't having it. "Do you know who I am?" she snapped. "I have a reservation at the Ritz in 40 minutes. I'm not standing in line like some common tourist." Her words were sharp and dismissive as she made it clear she felt above everyone around her. With a flick of her wrist, she waved away the attendant's concerns, her eyes fixed on the guards at the gates. "This is all just a tourist trap anyway," she muttered to herself, oblivious to the history and tradition that stood before her. As tourists eagerly pointed their cameras at the guards, Debbie refused to move, planting herself right in the path of the approaching unit. The first notes of the ceremonial music filled the air, signaling the imminent arrival of the guards. But Debbie remained in place, phone raised high, determined to get her shot. She didn't care that this wasn't just a show for her amusement. She was a paying visitor, and she believed the world should bend to her will. The air thickened with tension as the guards' rhythmic march grew louder. They were coming closer, and Debbie had no intention of moving. She was about to learn a lesson that no amount of money or status could shield her from. As the ceremonial music played louder, Debbie Whitmore remained defiantly rooted in the middle of the Royal Guard's path. The crowd, which had been excitedly snapping photos of the approaching guards, began to notice her obstinate stance. Whispers rippled through the tourists, some unsure of what was happening, while others exchanged uneasy glances. But Debbie paid no mind. She was intent on her moment, believing that her designer clothes and high status gave her the right to be in the center of it all. A seasoned veteran of the Royal Guard, James Windsor, was leading the approaching unit. With each step, his presence grew more commanding, as if the very air thickened with the weight of his discipline. His scarlet tunic gleamed in the afternoon sun, and the polished brass of his boots reflected the light as he marched forward with military precision. The gap between him and Debbie closed, but she was resolute, her phone raised, her smirk wide. She didn't budge. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, some concerned, others unsure how far this would go. A palace security officer called out urgently, "Clear the path. The guards will not stop." But Debbie refused, confident that the guards would have no choice but to go around her. "I'm not moving," she called out, her voice rising. "I paid good money to be here. You all work for us." Her arrogance was palpable, and she didn't care that her behavior was causing unease among those around her. As James Windsor drew closer, he remained as composed as ever. His steps didn't falter. The unit continued its march, a living symbol of military discipline that refused to deviate for anyone. The growing tension was almost unbearable. This was no longer about a photo or a tourist's moment of vanity. Debbie stood, still smirking, unaware that the lesson she was about to receive was about far more than tradition. It was about respect, dignity, and consequences. The moment of impact came suddenly, without warning. As the guard reached her, his broad shoulder collided with her side, just hard enough to send her stumbling back. Debbie fell to the cobblestones, her phone and sunglasses flying in different directions. Her smirk instantly vanished, replaced by shock and pain. But before she could even fully process what had just happened, she heard the steady rhythm of the guards' boots continuing their march, ignoring her completely. James Windsor had not broken stride. The crowd fell silent for a brief moment before the gasps, whispers, and camera clicks filled the air again. Debbie, now sitting on the ground, was left stunned by the swift and calculated response from the guard, his authority and discipline unshaken. She had tried to challenge something far greater than herself, and in doing so, she had only humbled herself. The air outside Buckingham Palace was thick with tension. Debbie Whitmore, now lying on the cobblestones, rubbed her bruised hand and scrambled to her feet, her designer outfit stained and disheveled. Her earlier confidence had shattered. James Windsor, the royal guard, didn't even glance back. His unit had continued its march as though she was nothing more than an obstacle in their path. The powerful rhythm of their boots echoed against the stone, and Debbie could feel the weight of her actions crashing down on her. Her fury was palpable, her face flushed red with embarrassment and rage. "You can't just do that," she screamed, her voice rising to a shriek as she scrambled to pick up her fallen phone. The security officer who had warned her earlier remained silent, his posture firm as he stood nearby. He had seen this type of behavior before, but this time, it felt different. Debbie, with all her entitlement and privilege, had underestimated the significance of the moment. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered, drawn to the spectacle of this entitled tourist's clash with authority. Some whispered with shock, others exchanged uneasy glances. The veteran who had tried to warn Debbie earlier, the one who had served his country with pride, simply shook his head. He knew how this would end, just as James Windsor knew the drill. This wasn't a game. It was about something far bigger than Debbie's lunch reservation or her desire to take a perfect picture. As Debbie ranted and raved, demanding apologies and threatening legal action, the crowd remained silent. It was clear that most of them, while sympathetic, had no real understanding of the respect these guards commanded. The guards weren't there to entertain or appease anyone's sense of privilege. They were there to uphold something far more sacred: tradition, duty, and respect. The more Debbie tried to assert herself, the more it became clear that her words meant nothing in the face of that unshakable discipline. The arrival of Captain Roberts only served to emphasize the gravity of the situation. He approached with the steady confidence of a career soldier, his expression unmoved by Debbie's escalating tirade. "Your actions today have shown a lack of respect for the guard and the duty they perform," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of military tradition. Debbie tried to argue, but Captain Roberts had already made it clear. The guards had acted within protocol, and Debbie was the one in the wrong. As the officers prepared to escort her away, Debbie's protests grew weaker, the reality of her situation setting in. This wasn't a tourist trap. This wasn't some kind of reality show where she could bend the rules. She had tried to break the guard's discipline, and in the end, it was she who had been broken. The tension in the air outside Buckingham Palace was palpable as Debbie stood there, hands shaking, her phone still clutched tightly in her bruised hand. The crowd had drawn back, their eyes fixed on her as she ranted about lawyers, media coverage, and revenge. She was a woman accustomed to getting what she wanted, but this time, her privileged sense of entitlement wasn't enough to bend the rules. As the Queen's Guard continued their flawless march, ignoring her existence, it was becoming clear that Debbie's outburst wasn't just an unfortunate incident. It was an inevitable clash between civilian arrogance and military discipline. Around her, the crowd had fallen silent. Even those who had been filming her initial encounter with the guard now lowered their phones, their discomfort evident. Debbie's voice grew shriller as she demanded to know why no one was doing anything to stop James Windsor, the guard who had acted with unwavering precision to clear her from his path. But as the seconds ticked by, and the police officers continued their measured response, it became more and more obvious that Debbie was on the losing side of this fight. Her face flushed an even deeper shade of red as the officers patiently explained her mistake. "You've been warned multiple times, ma'am," one of the officers said. The guard acted according to protocol. Protocol? Debbie scoffed. "You can't seriously expect me to believe that. I was attacked by a man in a costume. You're all complicit in this." Her shrill protests echoed through the square, but no one seemed to care. The tourists who had been initially intrigued by her antics now looked at her with a mixture of pity and judgment. The veteran who had warned her earlier watched quietly, shaking his head in silent understanding. He'd seen this kind of entitled behavior before, but this time, it was different. This time, the consequences were inevitable. The arrival of Captain Roberts, the guard captain, only amplified the gravity of the situation. He surveyed Debbie with a look of stoic authority. "Ma'am, I've been briefed on the situation." The guard acted within his orders. His tone was calm but firm, his words cutting through the air like a blade. Debbie opened her mouth to argue, but Captain Roberts silenced her with one glance. "This is not a game. These are soldiers performing a vital duty. You are interfering with that duty, and your actions have consequences." As the police prepared to escort Debbie away, her sense of entitlement finally began to crack. She wasn't going to get away with this one. She wasn't going to have her viral moment. She wasn't going to make headlines. Instead, her tantrum had exposed her own ignorance, her own lack of understanding of the very values that kept the country she claimed to love intact. As she was led away, her protests growing weaker, Captain Roberts turned to the crowd, his voice steady and unwavering. "Remember this moment, ladies and gentlemen. Tradition is not for entertainment, and those who stand guard here do so with a respect and dedication that must be honored." And with that, the crowd returned to its quiet reverence, leaving Debbie to process the lesson she'd just learned, the hard way. As the last words of Captain Roberts hung in the air, Debbie stood there, still fuming, her mind racing with disbelief. She had been led away by the officers, her hand throbbing from the impact of Guard Windsor's boot. But it wasn't the pain that was unbearable, it was the crushing realization that no one was listening to her anymore. The crowd, which had once been on her side, now watched her with indifference, their phones down, their attention firmly on the unfolding scene. The Queen's guards had not only ignored her physical presence, but they had completely shut her out, refusing to even acknowledge her existence. She had expected outrage, sympathy, perhaps even a standing ovation as she stormed out of the square, but instead, she had become the object of mockery. Her voice cracked as she continued to demand an apology, pointing at Guard Windsor, but the more she spoke, the less anyone seemed to care. The only sound now was the steady march of the guards as they resumed their duties, the beat of their boots echoing across the cobblestones with an unwavering rhythm. Behind her, the police officers were still calm, taking her statement with polite professionalism, but there was no denying the weight of what had just happened. The reality had sunk in. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't going to walk away unscathed, not with a viral story to share. Debbie's carefully constructed world of privilege and entitlement was crumbling around her. "Do you really think this is over?" she shouted at the police, her voice shrill and desperate, her eyes wild with frustration. "I'm going to have your jobs. You'll see. I'll make sure the world knows what happened here." But Captain Roberts had already moved on, his presence no longer required. The situation had been handled, and now it was time for the guards to return to their posts, as if nothing had happened. Guard Windsor, though, still stood tall and unshaken, his military precision unwavering. No amount of Debbie's tantrums could break him. He had done his duty, and he had done it with honor. As Debbie was escorted away, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her actions. She had learned the hard way that respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something earned. And in that moment, Guard Windsor had taught her just that, with nothing more than an unflinching display of discipline. The crowd, now quiet, began to disperse. Some were still whispering, others shaking their heads. But one thing was certain, no one would forget this lesson. Debbie's day had been ruined, but the traditions of the British Guard, the dignity they represented, and the principles of respect that had stood the test of time had come out on top. And that was the story that would last. We'd love to hear what you think. Have you ever witnessed a moment like this where authority and tradition clashed with entitlement? How would you have reacted if you were in the crowd or in Debbie's shoes? Leave us a comment below and share your thoughts. Do you think the Guard was right to stand firm, or do you think Debbie's frustration was justified? We value your perspective, and we can't wait to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell for more incredible tales. Share this video with your friends and family who appreciate powerful stories of respect, tradition, and discipline.